Good morning and welcome to our engagement with the Maiden Guardian. I am Spamanda Mhlongo, the Senior Programs Officer at the Democracy Development Program, and we hosted today's engagement to try and engage around issues around women's visibility. Recognizing that it's a significantly important month for women in South Africa and essentially the world, we wanted to try and discourse around what does it mean in various spaces for women's visibility and the work that needs to be done in order to ensure that we get the state of our economy, the state of our policy making, the state of our politics, and the state of our activism to adequately affect the role that women have played both historically but also currently in the space. So my role is just to give an official welcome on behalf of the Democracy Development Program, the Maiden Guardian, as well as the co-founder of the Democracy Development Program, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, on behalf of the Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, as well as the staff at DDP. We're really excited to be able to have this engagement with you. So please feel free to just chat, put any questions, any thoughts that might have been sparked even by the initial invitation to this engagement, based on what you've seen around Women's Month, around the issues facing women in this country. What are some of the things that are coming up for you and you think are vital and important for this discussion? We'd be happy to hear from you all throughout the course of the engagement. So the chat box is available. Please ask any questions. Please also introduce yourself and perhaps a bit about some of the initiatives that you might be conducting in order to try and balance the scale as it relates to women's equality and women's visibility in the country. Of course, this conversation doesn't happen through me or as a result of me being present, but we're joined by very special and very capable speakers in this space. But also the process itself will be led primarily by Ugogo Londiwe Mtambo, who is a program manager at the Rivonia Circle. She holds a master's degree specializing in feminist theory, African girlhood, and womanhood and security studies. So I'd like to invite Gogo Londi to be able to just take us through the process and also introduce us to the speakers that will be in the space today. The conversation is being recorded, so if any time you get cut off, do not worry. You can either rejoin back in immediately, or you can also catch us on the Maiden Guardian's YouTube page as and when the session will be ready. Probably at the end of the day, we'll have that available for you. Gogo, thank you very much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure. Good morning, everyone. Thokozani. As introduced, my name is Gogo Londi, and I'll be sort of steering and leading this conversation today. But I do that, of course, in partnership with some good friends and some new friends today, who are going to take us through today's conversation. It's Women's Month. 66 years since the Women's March that was specifically dealing with past laws, but more broadly, protesting against or protesting for civic rights and our liberties, right? Democratic rights, and the ways in which women can then engage their democratic rights and access their democratic rights. And so it's always a bit bittersweet when it comes to Women's Month. I've been seeing a lot of responses around the sort of Happy Women's Day with what's so happy about it. And so today we're going to have a discussion that sort of foregrounds and commemorates the Women's March, but also then looks at where we are now, our current context, and the kinds of things that we need to do in order to deal with women's visibility or lack thereof. I hope that the conversation will take us beyond conversations around representation, and that we'll get to the meat of the conversation. So our panelists today are some good friends of mine and some new friends of mine as well. We have Ulihle Ngcobozi, who'll be talking us through some policy work. She is a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. She'll be taking us through some of the policy and some of the governance conversations that we need to be having when it comes to women's visibility. We also have Nhlakanipho Mahlangu. She is a researcher at CANRAT at the Mandela University. She will then be taking us through some of the conversations around different women's movements and movements from the LGBTQI plus communities, and talking us through some of the gaps that we're seeing in the work and the responses from the government when it comes to responding to the issues being raised by those different movements. And then we have Uhleliwe, who's going to speak us through some of the existing frameworks. Uhleliwe Wakakhumalo, Mtungu. She's going to talk us through some of the existing frameworks dealing with gender-based violence and femicide, and talking us through some of her research on the different ways that communities and women have engaged issues around gender-based violence and femicide. Like I said, conversations around women's visibility, and particularly in Women's Month, are always a little bit bittersweet, just because of, I guess, the hyper visibility that happens in August. While violence continues to happen every day, while the oppression of women continues to happen every day, while the misrepresentation of women and of vulnerable communities continues to happen every day. And so while it's important for us to have this conversation, I think it's also important for us to note the sort of the hyper visibility that exists for us in this month, and the attention that we get in this month, but while we still live through the different violences that have been mentioned. I'm going to ask Lihle for you to introduce yourself, give us a minute about yourself and about the work that you're doing currently, and then go into your conversation around policy, governance, a conversation beyond gay representation as we would have it. Welcome, everyone.
Sure, thanks, Lawrence. I mean, Lundi and I are friends, so please don't mind me if I refer to her. I'm in a very friendly manner. Yeah, so my name is Lihle Ngozi, as Ukok has already said. I am a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, and really my primary areas of interest are around public governance, specifically looking at the state and looking at public institutions and the roles and how public institutions interact with the citizen, and in what ways that kind of interaction speaks to the ideas of governance or good governance, or the ways in which governance operates in South Africa through these particular institutions. I'm also somebody that's interested just more broadly in issues of gender liberation politics, specifically around women's participation with the state, and also women's participation and women's formations outside of the state as well, and how these impact the ways that women create their identities through varied institutions such as the church. So that's what I'm interested in. But today I'm really wanting us to have a conversation around this idea of gender governance and to make an analysis of how are we seeing this idea of gender governance taking place or shaping out in South Africa? And is it really doing the kinds of work that gender governance is supposed to do in relation to women and their positionality within the state and state institutions from a representation level, but also then from a more substantive level in terms of how women engage within institutions, how do they have access to particular protections from the state, and is the state governing in a way that prioritizes women, one, and two, is the state also governing in a way that understands the different intersecting issues that women are faced with, whether those are economic, whether those are political, whether those are around sex and sexuality, or whether those are around sort of their positionality within the broader conversation of politics and political discourse in South Africa. And so gender governance really is about trying to understand where and how governance place women within its affairs, within its institutions, and also how states place women within their modes of governance, and what are the kinds of apparatus, what are the kinds of instruments, and what are the kinds of policy direction and policy decisions do governments make to ensure that women become part of the mode of governance in South Africa and across the globe as well. And this also requires the state then to be very specific about being able to understand the different vantage points that different women across the country in South Africa, how they experience their womanhood, whether it's from a class perspective, a race perspective, a gender and sexuality perspective, from an economics or an income perspective, and how all of these then coalesce in the way that the state is primarily meant to make particular interventions that address all of these things, whether simultaneously or prioritizing them at one point or the other. But before we get into that conversation, I think we also need to take a step back in understanding the conception of the state, where the state primarily, and I think a lot of feminist scholars have spoken to this, where the state really in its formation was seen as a very masculinist kind of entity. And from a realist perspective, where the state was primarily interested in ensuring that it protects this idea of sovereignty, that it makes use of its legitimacy of violence in terms of being able to marshal all of its resources to ensure that there's a protection of the state, but also the protection of state interests, and also then in many ways to ensure that the state is able to survive with not only within the global economy, but also within the different political context around wars and those kinds of things. And then the state takes a very masculinist formation, right? And so what feminist scholars then do is that they argue that when we move out of this realist understanding of what the state is meant to be, and you move to a more social democratic understanding of what the state is supposed to be and how the state is meant to function, we then have to create the kinds of institutions that are very, very sensitive to the different demographics that the state is meant to sort of preside over, or the government presides over. So we understand sort of the race question, right? Specifically, if we're looking at South Africa, we understand that our government is meant to create the kinds of transformative policies and transformative interventions that are meant to redress the kinds of inequalities that are a result of our past in relation to apartheid, colonialism, and so on and so forth. And so the state then is meant to marshal its policy interventions and its resources in a way that is supposed to deal with ideas around redistributive justice, redistributive economies, and being able to create the kinds of economic frameworks that distill these ideas around white monopoly capital and so on. But when it comes to the women question in South Africa, I don't think the woman question in South Africa, we don't really have that kind of historical grasp around being able to think through gender governance, not just through the realm of GBV and the realm of violence, and really just locking women into a very particular understanding of which area rather the state is meant to govern where women are concerned. So in South Africa, we are seeing that the priority, or rather the dominant conversations around women and women's representation within society is twofold. On the one hand, we talk about women's equality, we talk about representation, we talk about women's empowerment, we talk about affirmative action, we talk about really transforming ideas around women having access to particular institutions for them to be represented equally on the one hand, and also for them to be able to exist in institutions where the cultures of masculinity are being distilled or being eradicated or being transformed, and to create a far more inclusive culture in public institutions. On the one hand, we have that. On the other hand, the state then becomes also primarily concerned with ideas around violence, GBV, and the kinds of ways that masculinity plays out in the interpersonal relations between heterosexual men and heterosexual women primarily, but also then the government tries, but in many ways does not do a great job at sort of also dealing with the different sexualities and sort of the different gendered individuals that exist in South Africa, will become implicated then in gender-based violence and the ways that masculinity plays out in society. And we find that South Africa becomes very particularly trapped within this idea of women and women's conversations being around most of the time gender-based violence. And I'm not saying that that is not a good thing, but I think the conversation around gender governance in South Africa needs to go beyond just the issues of gender-based violence, because there are many forms of structural and systemic violences that women, I don't know if violence is the word, but different forms of violence that women and marginalized people in South Africa have to deal with, beyond just the issue of GBV and the issue of violence. We need to think more broadly about how do we understand women's positions within the economy? How does the government respond to issues around care economies in South Africa? And how do we regulate those kinds of economies in a way that women don't become exploited and that care economies do not become part of just the way that we socialize women into the kinds of works that they're supposed to do, but how do we deal with the issues around ensuring that those kinds of economies are regulated and that there is some sort of insulation from exploitation on the one hand. We also need to think about, when we talk about women's development, and we know South Africa ascribes to a lot of conventions around understanding gender inequality, to issues around gender mainstreaming and all of that. However, substantively, when we look at the condition of women in South Africa, and Black women specifically, we see that the substantive part of women's protections where the state is concerned don't take the kinds of priorities that, for example, macro issues in South Africa take, for example, issues around the economy, issues around SOEs, issues around fiscal management. All of those things are seen as sort of the macro issues that governments and states need to deal with. And then issues of women still become auxiliary to the state or become part of sort of the secondary problem that governments need to deal with. And I think part of the issue in seeing sort of the draining of gender governance in South Africa is that we are really caught up in sort of big man politics and prioritizing big man institutions that in many ways are meant to ensure that the state functions adequately. And so in South Africa, we are seeing that sort of the gains around women's movement and social democratic movement and feminist movements in South Africa, we're really agitated for a gender governance approach to government in South Africa. We're really seeing the draining of those institutions. So, for example, the Department of Women and Children and People Living with Disabilities and Youth and everybody else that the government doesn't know what to do with, those kinds of institutions don't really have the kind of resources required for them to be able to be sort of the entry point for good gender governance in South Africa. We see institutions such as the Commission for Gender, GCE, and that kind of institution as well, being drained in the sense that the state is not plowing the kind of resources that will enable these kinds of institutions to have really significant and impactful work beyond just this idea of focusing on gender-based violence, but being able to have a far more intersectional approach in how we deal with issues around issues of women's place within society, and how we sort of deal with issues of inequality, and how then we try to distill the cultures of masculinity within the state and also, of course, within our society as well. And we also understand that the post-apartheid government was very instructive in introducing these ideas around social securities. And social securities really are an attempt to equalize the income gaps in South Africa, one, but also to sort of remedy the kind of historical legacy of unemployment and also the inability for people to have access to to incomes. And social securities in South Africa have become one of the key and prominent ways in which women or women within marginalized communities or marginalized women in general have access to some sort of income. And so those kinds of gendered approaches in South Africa, if we're also looking at things such as land reform, and we're also looking at gender sensitive budgeting in South Africa, all of these are meant to, in many ways, create the kind of socioeconomic conditions where women are able to thrive in South Africa. But we are seeing that in the substantive sense, that is not really taking place, and that we are really being caught up in public discourse that really prioritizes particular conversations over the issue of women and women's development. And women's development then does become some sort of a conversation that is sidelined and that the feminist movement or social democratic movements really then spearhead ideas around gender reform and reform in South Africa where women are concerned, specifically around gender-based violence, specifically around issues of making sure that there's gender-sensitive resource and infrastructures in government to ensure the protections of women's and women's rights. I think I'm going to stop there, and then I think I can just carry on in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lihle. I think, often we get, and I think, like you, as you've argued, we get stuck in a conversation that I think some of the feminist scholars have labeled as pathologizing womanhood or pathologizing girlhood, where often anything that has to do with women or that has to do with concerns around gender and gender governance has to happen from the lens of vulnerability or precarity. And that's not to argue that vulnerability and precarity doesn't exist, but it's to say that what else is happening in our lives? There's so much more that is happening in our lives. And so how do we create a state and a government that also prioritizes those other issues about us and about the ways in which we engage with society and the ways in which we interact with society? I'm going to ask that people please share their questions on the different platforms in the chat session so that I can filter those in for our speakers. Do join the conversation, do share the conversation on all your different social media platforms as well, so that we get the discussion going. I'm going to ask Untitled to come in. And she's going to take us through a conversation around the movements for the rights of LGBTQI plus communities, and the kinds of gaps that we see. Maybe just chat to us about some of the movements that exist and that have pushed for these rights. But I think more so for me, a conversation around what are the gaps in terms of government's response to these issues, and why it feels like we're stuck when it comes to these conversations. And I think Ulihle has rightly identified this position yokuba stuck in between representation, equality, and access, and violence, and that's the sort of lens that we look at these issues through. So welcome, Tlhakanipho. It's so good to see you again.
All right, thank you so much, Gogs. And thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak on this platform. I think we are correct to contextualize where we find ourselves in a position where we feel stuck. I know in the activist spaces that I occupy, we feel these conversations are conversations we've been having for a long time, and we are constantly curious as to what is next, what can we ask for, what can we do that will substantially change the lives that we live. And so I think that part of the contributor to that is this building identity or understanding our identities in terms of precarity, where we understand the LGBTQ experience, for example, as an experience that is rife and filled with violence and filled with brutality, but we actually don't know, for example, LGBTQ history, LGBTQ resistance, and we don't know those narratives. And the knowledge of those narratives are really is really something that is known by small enclaves of people who are interested in it, but it's not part of the broader political discussion and the broader ways in which our country makes sense of itself, right? And so my contribution is mainly, as Gogo has alluded to speak on LGBTQ experience and to speak on LGBTQ movements. And I think that this is part of the need to complicate the way in which we understand the experience of gendered minorities, understanding it beyond women, but also understanding the rich intersections that exist between the LGBTQ experiences and the experiences of women in this country, and the need to take LGBTQ discourse and actually make it part of the dominant discourse within politics and other frames of leadership. All right. So I'm going to be focusing, as Goza said, on the LGBTQ community, right? And I characterize this community as one that has had a rich history of resistance, and one that I would say is in a sort of circular relationship with the law, all right? And we have to laud movements such as the total shutdown movement, Fees Must Fall, such as GLOW, who brought to the fore the need for us to understand marginalized marginalized gender experiences in ways that are inclusive of the LGBTQ experience. And that doesn't just focus solely on women, not because women are not important, but because they are rich intersections and things that are happening in that space that are particular to the LGBTQ space. And we also need to laud people who are working to preserve the legacies of those who have been victimized and brutalized, who are trying to complicate the ways in which we understand these experiences. So we look at, for example, UD Simelane, whose experience was one that was very wrought with violence, but who also had a very budding sporting career. And so we also need to laud these types of movements that are trying to complicate the way we understand the people who are experiencing this violence, and to understand the violence itself as just a small part of the experience, but rooted in the experience is a deep culture, is a way of life, is a love for a community, a love for a people, all right? And so I characterize, as I said earlier, the LGBTQ movements as in this circular relationship with the law, right? Where we run to the law for particular changes, right? So movements like GLOW, who wanted to merge the imperatives of racial emancipation with concerns of LGBTQ freedom and emancipation, right? And we pick up codes such as Simon Godi's classic, I am Black and I am gay. And we run to the law because we want the law as an institution of power in our country to recognize LGBTQ people. And that's where we see great strides being made in terms of constitutional provisions to protect LGBTQ rights, the Civil Union Act. But all of that progress is being made in a broader context of violence, a broader context where we see the UD Simelanes who die brutal deaths every day. We also look to movements like the Total Shutdown movement, who later on comes in and says enough is enough with the lives that LGBTQ people are living, enough is enough with the violence and the brutality and the fear that characterize our lives as women and LGBTQ people. And we see that also culminates, for example, in a national strategy against gender-based violence and femicide. However, all of this still happens in a backdrop of very rife LGBTQ health concerns, for example, where trans people don't have access to gender-affirming medical care, a context in which LGBTQ people still experience difficulties finding jobs because of conservative corporate cultures, a context in which LGBTQ people, students in schools, the lives of children in schools are still very characterized by, ostracization, exclusion, violence, and abuse. Okay, and the end of all of this circular relationship, where we're constantly running to the law, is that we have to conclude and see the ways in which the law doesn't change lives, because it can't change cultures. While I was preparing, I watched a documentary on I believe it was the Civil Union Act. And every activist who spoke in that documentary spoke of how the Civil Union Act is just a stepping stone towards changing the cultures of society. But we see the ways in which in our society that is not happening. The promises of the law are not our daily experiences. The promises of freedom, safety, those are not the experiences that we have. And so we see and we identify that the critical gap exists in this space of trying to influence cultures, of trying to influence something as simple as the way a business runs itself. Because at the end of the day, we don't coexist with laws, we don't coexist with these strategies, but we coexist with people and the prevailing cultures and beliefs that shape them. So interrogating what do we do about this? How do we go forward? We have to recognize as well that there exists a very strong and a very active civil society that is trying to permeate into cultures and trying to make the types of moves that will make LGBTQ inclusivity something that is a lived experience for LGBTQ people. However, that civil society is very underfunded, very exhausted, and very under-resourced to do the work that they do in ways that can be scalable, in ways that can be taken across throughout the country. And so I argue that a big part of the work that we need to be doing is moving away just from LGBTQ integration, where we are able to include LGBTQ concerns in a policy document, but really look towards how we can endeavor to make the reality LGBTQ inclusion and belonging. And in the work that I do, I look at relationship management, for example, as a business process that can be used to change business cultures in order to create LGBTQ inclusive experiences. And I think that this type of work is the work that we should all be doing in our small areas of influence, in our small areas of expertise, where we look at ways to build meaningful strategies to meaningfully impact culture and thereby impact or change LGBTQ experiences. I think I'm going to stop there for now, Lawrence, and engage later in the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Clara. I think it's important for us to engage the questions around how do we create tangible ushintsho oluphathekayo for people's lives. And if we can agree that the state in its construction and in its conception is a masculine project, then, and if we can agree that often issues around care economies, women's emancipations from exploitation, the protection of women, social protection, and all those issues, and then we can also agree that issues around gendered vulnerabilities and people from the LGBTI plus communities, that all their issues fall outside of the lens of the state or the lens of the government. And as Unhlakanipho is arguing that the laws and the state don't change people's lives, then we have to have a conversation about what we do with the state as an instrument. And so one of our participants, Unombulelo Wakashange, is asking around is asking a question around these issues, right? If the state is historically male and masculine, is it then suited to deal with the issues that we're talking about today? Would tackling these issues and many other of the social issues that we face require us to dismantle the state first? Would transforming the state, even towards gender governance, not mean that we still carry forward the violent masculine foundation of the state? And I think that that's a question for both Unhlakanipho Nolihle to consider, about the state as an instrument, and Unhlakanipho, as you've mentioned, particularly the law as an instrument. What do we do with these instruments? Do we dismantle? Do we transform them? How do we push them towards being able to respond to the issues that both of you have brought to the forefront today? And we'll come back to you to get those questions. And maybe if participants can also respond to those questions and those concerns, and respond to both Unhlakanipho Nolihle's presentation so far. We'll take Uhleliwe to take us through a conversation around gender-based violence and the recommendations that you are seeing in your field and in your research, particularly in the ways that we deal with gender-based violence. And I think the reason gender-based violence often is the center of these conversations around whether we're talking total shutdown and we're talking the LGBTQI plus communities, or we're talking women, whichever vulnerable communities we're talking about, the reason it becomes the center is because it's something that we deal with literally every single day. We live in fear, we are in danger every single day. And so there has to be interventions made towards it. Please take us through some of your own research and your recommendations there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. As you had mentioned, Interpol has also just reported South Africa as the rape capital of the world. So this is really telling of the nature of how us women feel unsafe in the country. In the past 2 weeks, the raping of 8 women, is also very telling of the current atmosphere in South Africa at the moment. What I really want to draw our attention to is sort of looking at, my studies based with an indigenous perspective, right, and how we can use a gender transformative approach, into engaging men, because I honestly believe that part of the problem is that the past interventions that have been developed do not engage men, do not call men to be participants, to be active participants and stakeholders into changing behaviors. So the first main problem that we have is the need to engage men in this discussion. It's for men to be present when we are having gender-based violence and femicide discussions. Secondly, it is also to challenge gender norms, because that is one of the major factors that really continue to perpetuate gender-based violence. And also understanding that, gender inequality is the root cause of gender-based violence. So within my study and what I've been able to attain thus far is that it's understanding that we need interventions that are indigenously informed. We need interventions that will speak to what we have excess of at the moment in our communities, right? Because we have the government strategies, how we must take the multisectoral coordinating structures to respond to gender-based violence. We have the national strategic plan, that is in place to combat challenges of gender-based violence, but even though we have, even the 3 past laws that were signed into law this year, it's progressive, it's a step in the right direction. But what we are really missing as well is to go back into our societies. It is to look at what are some of the challenges that continue to influence these challenges that we face. How can we change gender norms within our homes? What are we teaching our kids? What are we teaching the boy child? What are we teaching the girl child? Some of the social norms, the normal behavior of saying that, men will be men, or ungangeni indaba of abantu abathandanayo and all of those issues. We should also accept how they contribute to gender-based violence, to the issues that we have in South Africa, and how really gender-based violence just continues to be an issue in our country, right? And with looking at my study, I propose looking at male initiation schools as intervention strategies. I understand it is a very heavily contested subject in recent years, but the aim really is to look at how we can use male initiation schools. If there's a need to refine these schools, if there's a need to enhance, if there's a need to conceptualize male initiation schools, in a sense that we get the relevant stakeholders, we get the government, we get civil society, academics, policymakers, and the traditional house of authorities or leaders. We get them involved and in discussions as to how then we can create spaces in which boys are taught, are taught about gender inequality, are taught about gender equity and gender equality. Getting these teachings into such cultural practices as a start, because that's where some of the problems begin. And in no way am I not acknowledging that, within male initiation schools, there are, to a certain extent, challenges of, perpetuation of gender norms, patriarchal attitudes and ideas, and also homophobic attitudes. But really, the start is that to understand that if we are able to target boys while they're young or while they graduate to manhood, in getting them to think differently about how they view women and how they see women, right? Creating the gender equality within both boys and girls, it'll be a very good start, because the aim as well in creating gender GBF interventions is to target attitudes, right? Target attitudes, target behavioral change. We most of us are aware of how kids, we often say I'm a 2000 as problematic, but we really honestly need to start targeting attitudes. And we cannot just only rely on having all these legislations at the top, having to respond to gender-based violence. What are we doing on the ground? What are we doing as communities to sort of address these issues, to change this thinking? Because if we are really focusing at creating or responding to gender-based violence, we will forever be where we are at the moment, because we are not starting where we should start. If we feel like cultural norms also perpetuate GBV, then why not turn back to cultural norms and say, what is wrong with our culture in this part? What can we change about it? And how can we change for the better? It's also understanding that within most societies, it's woman-headed households. There's a lack of fathers involved in especially in a boy's life. So as a result, then we are having all these problems. So let's look at male initiation schools, not just for gender-based violence interventions, but also as means to equip these boys, to educate and mentor and coach these boys into who they become, at the end of the day. So I honestly feel that it's very important for us to engage boys, to engage men, and to change social and gender norms. It's time that we start thinking out of the box with these issues. It's time that we started considering our African indigenous knowledge systems, what has been happening for all these years, and what we can work on and improve. So that's very one important aspect. And also it's acknowledging that, gender-based violence is a complex phenomenon. There's no denying that. There's a lot of risk factors that are involved. There's no single intervention that will literally end gender-based violence. There's multiple interventions that are needed at different socio-ecological model, at individual level, at relationship, community, and society at large. But the core really is to start thinking within our societies, what can we use? And, male initiation school might be maybe quite limited at the moment, but, that's how intervention starts. We start small and then we grow. So we need to be able to also acknowledge and understand the importance of actually getting boys involved, changing their behaviors, and also, at a later stage, changing women's behavior as well, and how we feel, how we have sort of internalized subordination and saying, the man is superior, or playing into the patriarchal attitudes that are there in society. So it's very important that we really start to understand our role that we play, that we start looking at African indigenous knowledge systems as really part of an intervention strategy, right? Because with each gender transformative approach, it really speaks to men participating and being stakeholders in sort of determining or creating interventions that will result or that will lead to the end of gender-based violence. So that is really my call, that instead of maybe always being considerate of what literature is saying or what the World Health Organization suggested as interventions, how about we also look locally? Let's be context-based. Let's look at our within our own horizon, within our own paradigm. Let's look at those issues and let's say, how can we, as African, in an African context, challenge all these ideas? I'm going to stop there for now. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Hleliwe, for that intervention. I'm going to ask that we go back to, while I wait for comments and questions, from the participants. I think firstly, thank you so much to our speakers for engaging us and for the thought-provoking presentations. Lihle, I'm going to ask that you maybe answer the question around what do we do with the state? If we agree with it's inherently in its conception masculine, what do we do with it as an instrument? Because that's what we have right now. Do we dismantle? Do we transform? How do we move it in order for it to respond to the things that you were talking about around gender governance?
I mean, I think the state is very important as an institution, because in many ways the state has the resources to do things that individual citizens, we can't do that, right? And part of the state and the different arms of the state in terms of the legislature, the judiciary, and sort of the executive, all of these kinds of institutions are very important. And the concept of the state, for me, still holds a lot of resonance. If you look at the way that international relations functions, if you think about the global political economy, and if you think about the interrelations between countries and how we think about bilateral agreements and all of that stuff, the state is as a concept, or as an entity rather, is important. What I think the problem becomes is that because the state primarily comes out of this idealist tradition. So if you think about IR, I'm not idealist, realist conception around violence, about the state having legitimacy over violence, the state being able to make particular decisions around how it protects its interest. The interests then of the nation, or the interests of the state, then become around this ideas. It becomes very masculine in understanding what are the interests of the state. And the state then prioritizes very macro kinds of areas of statehood around fiscal management, the economy. And those big sort of conversations in many ways do not think about how womanhood then can become, not womanhood, women's issues or LGBTI concerns or different gendered concerns then have to become part of the governance structure of the state. And so what happens is that when states try to then reform in a way to include a very gendered approach to how we run our institutions, we then assume that the more women we put in power, then that means that the right sort of gendered approaches will then be considered. And then there'll be this automatic trickle down effect where the more women we put in, which means we're more progressive, which means institutions reform, when then by implication means society reforms, right? And that's not the case. We're seeing in South Africa that what Amina Mama calls femocratic, they are femocrats. And femocrats are women who become part of the state and are then become co-opted into sort of the masculinist tradition of how governance works. And so these kinds of women who are femocrats do not create the kinds of conditions where gender governance can then be able to take shape within key institutions. And what they do is that these women then align themselves with the different power networks within the state, and that their primary concern becomes how then do they become part of the powerful networks within the state, and also then how do they align themselves within the different factional networks within parties, within the state as well. And so the agenda then for women or for LGBTI or for vulnerable people then becomes vulnerable in and of itself, because the prioritization of it does not become part and parcel of the issues of governance. And so women then become primarily concerned again with issues of factionalism. They become concerned with issues of power dynamics in terms of who do they align to make sure that they are part of the next incumbent and all of that. And all of those things then show us that fundamentally the cultures and tradition of governance in South Africa in many ways or institutions rather prioritize the kinds of masculinist networks And then because you prioritize those networks, the gender governance then becomes sort of a by the way kind of thing. And that institutions that are meant to be uplifted or given the kinds of resources that they're supposed to get become sort of drained. And so I think part of the issue that South Africa also has is that when we think about corruption and we think about issues of sort of the 9 wasted years and we think about fiscal mismanagement and all of that, we don't think about the general implications that it has, not only on the fiscus, but on the real day-to-day experiences that women have in their inability to be able to get the kinds of protections that gender governance is supposed to create. And so when we think about corruption, we think about the impact that corruption has, it's not just about draining of the national purse. That national purse being drained speaks directly to whether or not gender-sensitive budgeting will take place in a way that is able to plow resources into the kinds of institutions that are meant to preside over this idea of gender governance. And so the inability of the state to be able to see those kinds of intersecting issues and how they impact not just institutions, but also how they impact public-facing services that a lot of women and LGBTI people, as well as people who are vulnerable from a gendered perspective, those kinds of public-facing services also become implicated at in the ways in which gender governance doesn't work in the way that it should. And so when we're thinking about the state, we're not just thinking about, does the judiciary work, does sort of the executive work, but in the day-to-day material conditions of women, does gender governance create the kinds of conditions where the protections of these particular people are ensured in a way that there's substantive change in their lives? And I don't think that takes place. And so I don't think that there is even sort of the kinds of conversations happening at that kind of level in South Africa, more than it is around, placating us with things around, red lipstick, whatever, that they do on Women's Month. And I think we really need to push the government to really just move beyond that kind of discourse and have a very serious, not just theoretical conversation about what do they understand to be the role of the government in relation to gender governance. And I don't think that's the kind of thing that's taking place.
And I mean, I think interestingly, there is so much work being done around feminist economies, gender. There is just so much work being done. And it's not work that has started maybe in the last year or two. It dates all the way back, to when or Dr. Bev Beatty, right? When they were having these conversations, when we were transitioning into this democratic state that we now live in. And so for me, there's a very clear just gap between the work that the feminist movement and the LGBTQI plus movements have done in order to think about statehood, in order to think about governance, and in order to think about the law that just isn't translating to practically into governance. And I think, I find that surprising, that we are not using the work that already exists, the brains that have thought through all of these issues in order to solve these issues in the way that you say, in tangible and substantive ways for people. So we've got a couple of comments as well. And I'm going to ask that you respond to some of the issues around when we collapse. And I think that this speaks to the training of civil society and the training of the institutions that Ulihle was talking about, like this sort of weird collapsing of women's issues and collapsing of LGBTIQI plus communities as if it's one thing. So the gendered approach, if there is one in governance, sort of just collapses us into one category, as if there aren't different vulnerabilities that exist. So I'm going to ask you to respond to that, but I want to take some of the comments as well, and some of the questions that are coming from the audience joining us around the country. So one of the comments is around, and I think it responds to Uhleliwe's presentation, it's around values. So the values that we learn come from our family and our home experiences. We need to be more aware of what values we instill in children. Also, children practice what they observe. They imitate adult behavior. We need to identify what we are doing wrong and correct, that so that our children imitate our values and behavior, and that's not questionable. And then the second question is around, again, Unombulelo Shange is asking, how do we bring these very masculine spaces to the party? Male initiation schools are very masculine. Could similar traditional structures like Ubungoma, usually being more feminine spaces, be meaningful here in aiding with preemptive interventions? Maybe Ukoko can also share her insights with this regard. I'll do that. So yeah, so let's take those two. I'll start with Untlaga and then go to Hleliwe, and then we'll take more, ne?
All right, thank you, Lons. I think it has to do with, it's a lack of creativity, or a lack of understanding the finer differences between these two groups. So for me, it comes from not wanting to complicate narratives. So right now we're looking at GBV. Let's just add an LGBTQ element to this GBV. And so even if you look at the types of documents that are produced in terms of strategic documents, you look at a document where, you know, LGBT is just a page of 100. And it has to do with us not wanting to complicate our understanding of what it is to experience being a marginalized gender identity, or who have a marginalized gender identity. And I agree with Liche in many ways, because we do need the state. The state, as she says, has the resources to bring about the types of initiatives that need to be brought about in order to substantially change lives. And the state is the entity that can actually carry the type of interventions that are necessary. But we also need to be alive to the limitations of the state, right? And so when we speak of the ways in which someone's values comes from their family, how do we then infiltrate families? You know, because the state can't do that work. And maybe it can through social workers and such, but those interventions can be very limited. So how do we then transcend those values and teach the types of values we want young children to learn? And so my work looks at the school as a critical part of that intervention, right? And at secondary level, primary level. So there have been many critiques, for example, of the life orientation syllabus. And the problem again becomes that we want to take these concerns and just put them into the life orientation syllabus, when actually in every single subject, there needs to be something raised about women. You know, maybe in maths, we can learn about women mathematicians and, you know, spark creativity in terms of how we learn about the experience, the daily experience of being a gender minority. And I think that it really requires us to exercise a lot of creativity. It's work that we're constantly needing to do. When we look at a policy, we need to look at the extent to which this policy influences issues of gender. And so what gender mainstreaming has meant so far is that we just add policy and strategic document on top of other strategic documents. But it hasn't really meant that we can look at something that's already there and look at the extent to which it influences gender and want to write into existing structures, you know, more influence. And I argue that, you know, we can't do without the law. We need the law, for example, to say that XYZ is wrong, right? So that when I have this type of experience, I've got recourse. And the law is the mechanism through which we get recourse. But it's about really thinking about how we impact lives, how we clash with cultures, or how we engage cultures or engage the prevailing belief systems in ways that are really meaningful. And it's just work that needs to be done by somebody who needs to be paid very well. So, yeah.
Hleliwe, let's come to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you to Nombulelo for that question. I think definitely, you know, it will be another part or another angle that challenging these notions of gender norms can be used. We can use izangoma as facilitators of this. You know, I used the male initiation schools because, you know, they're already in existence and they are male centered. So it's challenging what they know already, is challenging the norms, you know, gender norms and social norms. So that was really my point of departure, but definitely I'm looking into izangoma. So just wondering if she was saying that looking into izangoma as facilitators of male initiation schools or something completely different. So that wasn't a bit clear on my part, but yeah, and also just with the statements that a participant made earlier, you know, for some people, you know, as much as we are supposed to be taught all these values at home, you know, and I'd mentioned that, you know, some homes are woman-headed, are child-headed, you know, these opportunities do not exist for young boys and girls to learn moral values, to learn how to behave and to learn attitudes. So as a result, you know, as a society, we find ourselves with these challenges that we have currently. So hence looking at mentors, people like the traditional guidance who would assist, and obviously with them obviously getting the necessary training, you know, because I'm not taking for granted that they are aware of the gender norms or if they do not perpetuate the gender norms, but it's just making, you know, a statement based on what is already there. Thank you.
Look, I think interestingly, in my experience as a gogo, and I think just in my research around girlhood and womanhood, what I found really interesting was that in order for us to shift cultural norms, we have to engage the cultural gatekeepers. So in my research on Zulu girlhood, for example, it became very clear to me that Zulu women themselves have been shifting cultural norms in subtle ways, ngendlela enganakekile, but that allow for girls and women to express their womanhoods in different ways, that allow for women and girls to have access to economic emancipation, that allow for girls to just live their lives without being under pressure around when we talk about preservation, and particularly when it comes to Zulu girlhood and womanhood, preservation of virginity as a thing. It became clear to me, Uguti, we have to have conversations with the people who are the ones who are the cultural gatekeepers, who are the ones shifting these norms. But again, women have that burden, right, of being the ones who make the subtle shifts, amadodenga nagile kind of thing, in order to shift and to change our societies. And again, that's just, I mean, it's work that we do, but it's tiring. Even in the spaces zobungoma, often I don't experience the space yobungoma in very gendered ways, because I am a gogo, I am mkulu, I am whoever I need to be at the point that I am. And that's, you know, that goes for everyone. But we also then operate within patriarchal communities, right? Nabo okobela who buy into patriarchal norms. And so guys, gubi and gunzima. And so I agree with where we need to direct interventions, that our interventions need to be directed within our communities and within our spaces, within our families, but they have to be directed on a state level as well. I think that intervention is important. And I think that these interventions are not mutually exclusive, right? They can happen on both or on all the different levels. I'm gonna go to a comment and then there's another question, and then maybe we'll start rounding up, maybe taking some final comments from you guys, but maybe even some responses to each other's presentations as well. So one of the comments from Uspamandla Mhlongo says, I was at the Marikana Memorial last night. An interesting comment from one of the widows of the Marikana 44 said, till this day, the Women's League, and I assume this is the ANC Women's League, has not come to pay their respects and grieve together with them. If we look at how they responded to Kwezi back in 2006, 2007, it is important to interrogate the role of women and the Women's League in political structures. I think we can have a long conversation about particularly the ANC Women's League and the concept of democracy that Ulihle was talking about earlier on, and this idea of patriarchal bargaining that the ANC Women's League has fallen into the trap of doing. It's a long conversation. And then the next question is around, it's from Utobile Wagadlamini. On the point of structural and systematic violence in South Africa, how do we dismantle that? I think that is a big question, and it's a question that maybe all of us seek to answer with the different work that we're doing. I don't know if anyone would like to take a stab at answering that question now. So I just want to take 2 more comments and then I'll come to you guys for responses. Women are often made to feel less human in many instances. When they do try to speak up, they are portrayed as women without a proper upbringing. And then the next comment is from Unkanyiso Smelane. I agree with Uhleliwe. Gender-based violence is a moral issue at its core. And I believe that the religious sectors can play a leading role in assisting this. The economic and political inequalities of gender are a product of moral decay. While the judiciary and the police interventions are more reactionary than preventative measures, we need to also think about more preventative approaches. So, I mean, I think clearly this is a conversation that is happening on a structural and a systematic kind of level, but also is happening on the sort of political, cultural, and norms conversation. I don't know if you guys want to take a stab at how we dismantle the systematic oppression and violence that's happening in South Africa. I don't have the answers. I think, parts of the work that we do as feminists in different spaces seeks to answer that question broadly, or specifically in the different fields that we are in. But I don't know if you guys want to try and answer that question today. Well, let me go to Hleliwe, some responses from you, and then we'll go to Nhlaga and then Ulihle. And then we'll take closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. For me personally, it's such a wordy question. The only way, the beginning of dismantling the violence in our country would be an active and existing and working law. If we're having all these legislations, are they being implemented? The 3 laws that were passed, and also looking at how, there's been called to provide necessary resources and adequate funds, there has been no sense of accountability, no coordination, and also no accountability from the government in terms of how these funds have been distributed. Victims of gender-based violence are still not catered for. NGOs are still affected because they cannot run the organizations without the funding or the help from the government. So it really starts with ensuring that we have a working system, we have a working law that is also that takes working with these issues, that takes violence seriously, right? So I'll really stop it there with this question, but it's really looking at our legislation, looking at our law, and looking at the implementation measures. The president spoke on Women's Day about how taking responsibility, about how men must take responsibility, and all of that. But there was no mention of what they've done since the summit in 2018. The next summit is coming in November this year, but what has been done, how are they accounting for what they've said they're going to do? So we really, and as a citizen, we really need to be asking those questions, where are what has been implemented? How is all these challenges or the strategic plan been planned out, or how is it turning out in reality? Those are very important questions.
I think for me, we need to infiltrate whatever dominant value system that particular institution has. So if a business, for example, is concerned about profits, let's take this change that we want to make and write it into part of the profit-making mechanisms, for example. If a community values church, let's approach the church and let's speak to the church and lobby these different entities. And I think that's how we change systemic violence, because that's how we influence culture and we influence the lives that people live. And I also just read now a comment about this democratic approach. And I think that part of that is also a part of survival within the leadership spaces that we occupy. So how do we reframe or change these leadership spaces to not necessitate that now I must be concerned about what is this factions and all of that, but allow me to lead in a way that is concerned with the things that I'm concerned about. And so I think that it really needs us to be aware of whatever value system exists in that community and to try and engage at that level. So in a community that believes in the church, let's engage the church and let's speak to the church and let's try and change lives through the church. I think sometimes we try and bring in other vehicles, and then you find clashes and you find weird things happening. Whereas we can use the vehicles that exist in our communities to bring about the change that we need.
I'm not sure what more I can add, but I think the question around how to, someone said GBV is a moral issue, right? It's wrong. It's bad. Like, sure. Okay, we get it. But I think beyond that is that society emboldens men into believing that there are no consequences to their actions, and that the institutions that are meant to provide recourse where an injustice has been done or a sort of violent act has taken place or men have acted in a particular violent way towards vulnerable individuals, the lack of consequence is what emboldens men to continue doing that. And I'm not just talking about consequence from a legal or for a justice perspective, but in terms of society as well. There's no social ostracization that rapists or people that are violent or murderers, whatever, that kind of social, that doesn't take place because as society, we're at the point where it's just another day. If somebody, is accused of rape or somebody has committed a particular act, this kind of social ostracization or the consequence from a social perspective, that really doesn't take place. And that emboldens men into believing that there really is no consequence for this kind of action, on the one hand. And two, I also think the idea around violence as a concept that is structural, and that violence in and of itself is sort of like is part of our systemic way of interacting with people or with each other, from a gendered perspective. I also think that it needs a very systematic and structural approach that really takes a very intersectional understanding of why violence occurs. What are the kinds of cultures that promote violence? And what are the kinds of socioeconomic conditions that create the kind of violent responses that are taking place in society? And how then do we align the kinds of policy interventions that deal with why and how violence takes place and takes shape in South Africa? And I think a lot of feminist scholars have argued that it's not just about violent masculinities. Sure, we understand that masculinities are violent, and we understand that the heterosexual ordering of society begets a particular kind of violence. But beyond that, there is a socioeconomic dynamic that I think is very much part of why violence takes place in a way that it does in South Africa. And that's not to take away responsibility from people that enact these kinds of acts on women. That's not to say that people don't have jobs and that is why they rape. That's not what I'm saying. But I think the kinds of material conditions that create the kinds of restlessness in society create the kind of violent outbursts that we're seeing in society, and that we need to take a more intersectional and far broader approach in understanding what are also the psychological implications around our understandings of violence. What are the sort of the psychosocial conditions in South Africa that create the kind of violences that are taking shape and that are taking place? And I don't think that we have at that level of governance the kinds of expertise that are preventative in trying to deal with issues of violence. If we think about the comment that a very senior ANC official, Lindiwe Sisulu, made as a response to gender-based violence, where she says one of the policy positions that came out of a commission was that we need to think about chemical castration. And so that for me shows me the level of thinking around how we respond to GBV, and that people are not, the government itself or people within governance institutions are also at a loss, and they don't even know how to deal with it. And so they are regressing at a very scary rate. And the regression of the conversation within governance institutions themselves is very scary. And it's telling us that there really are no new ideas that are taking place, there are no new serious policy interventions, and that the state itself has in many ways abdicated its role to civil society. And civil society is now really the space in which we're thinking and seeing new and creative ideas around policy intervention, around these ideas of how we can compel the state to function in a way that is gender sensitive and is aware of its responsibility in relation to gender governance. And so we are seeing that civil society then becomes that kind of space. And in the hollowing out of the state's capacity and ability to govern in a way that inspires new ideas around how to deal with gender issues becomes the role of civil society. And when civil society doesn't have the resources to do that, then that also becomes a problem. But I think those are my my concluding comments. Thank you.
No, thank you, guys. I think I think we're in a man, we're in a bit of a crisis around when now civil society is the one that is thinking creatively and solutioning for government. And I think that is the case, surprisingly, in all sectors, right? When we think about the disaster management in KZN, civil society is the one thinking through that. Civil society is the one solutioning for that. When we think about when you think about, Discovery have now been having a whole fire brigade and a whole Home Affairs inside Discovery Bank, where you have civil society and the private sector now actively solutioning for the government, just because there's a clear lack and a clear inability for solutioning. I think for me, it is important for us to continue to hold the state and the government accountable. They can't just escape their responsibilities. And if they are unable to think creatively, they must call us. They must call you guys who are doing the work, who are thinking through the solutioning for these different issues, right? And I think that that's incredibly important. Where the work already exists, the solutioning and the thinking around the solutioning already exists, let's utilize that. And I think then, for me, some of the things to take away from this conversation around think creatively. Let's just, I guess, when we think about solutioning and when we think about the issues and the gaps that we're talking about, particularly because in this hour-long conversation, we've clearly been able to identify the gaps, right? And so what do we do? And I think that there are people who are already doing that work, and so we must use them. Second thing is, how do we use the things that already exist in our society, that people place value on in our societies, in order to change and shift our cultures and create this thing Ulihle was talking about around consequence, for example, when it comes to violence, and around moving away from it just being another day. And insisting on women's issues not just being an auxiliary to state issues, to the bigger issues of the state. You sort of get to item 10, and that's when we're talking about women's issues. And I think that that's important, that women's issues and gendered governance becomes a part of the state machinery rather than into that one department, the Department of Youth, Women, and People with Disabilities, and everybody else sort of deals with, right? And is under-resourced to deal with. There's one final comment coming in here, and I'll try and respond to it. It's around this question on equality when we celebrate Women's Day, and then there's no Men's Day. If there's no Men's Day, then how do we think about equality? Look, I think often people use conceptions around Men's Day or men get raped too, men face violence too, in order to sort of uksusa the importance around Women's Day and uksusa the importance around the structural and cultural violence that women and other vulnerable groups face in our societies. And I think, I mean, if we think about the way that society is structured in these patriarchal ways, I mean, really, the conception of a Men's Day is every day, comrades, because of the ways in which society is structured and the ways in which violence and oppression continue to be meted upon women and other vulnerable bodies. I am going to start rounding up, Spamandla. I think we've reached really the end of the discussion. Thank you so much to everyone for joining this discussion, and thank you so much to our speakers for sharing so much of yourselves and of your work and of your own experiences in this conversation. It has been an absolute pleasure. What a wonderful way to spend my morning. Thank you so much, everyone, and Spamandla for inviting us with the DDP and the Mail and Guardian. Spamandla?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What an enriching discussion. And these are not just platitudes. Thank you very much, Lihle. Thank you very much, Hleliwe. Thank you very much, Nhlakanipho and Gogolondi, for that amazing discussion. It was really important for us to be essentially take a backseat. One of the core ways in which we do our work at the DDP, or at least in terms of our methodology or way of conducting discussions, is how much listening are we able to do, taking a backseat and actually listening to the conversations that happen. So when we chose to have this panel discussion, and we decided, Wuti, it's important for us to also take a backseat. As someone who comes in with a particular sort of privilege, being male in South Africa, being and having a particular positionality insofar as heteronormative perspectives, it was important that we also embody this principle of listening as a core feature of the way in which we try to engage and become a part of this discussion. So I really appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to be a participant and be led and to hear from the various voices that came through. We really appreciate the participation from the audience as well. The questions, the comments were quite enlightening, and we hope that this discussion doesn't just end here, or at least that we're able to take this discussion in other platforms as well. As indicated earlier, the discussion and the webinar itself is also on the Mail and Guardian YouTube page. And so we hope that you're able to, in your own time, if there are things that piqued your interest, go back to it, but also share with other people who might not have been able to make the platform today. And so as part of the work of trying to create the space for visibility, the space for equality in a sense, and justice, genuinely, that this remains a core part of our work. And so thank you to Londi, thank you to Hleliwe, thank you to Ulihle, and thank you to Nhlakanipho for sharing your insights and your time. But also thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the Mail and Guardian, the Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, as well as the staff of the DDP for making this possible. We are available on social media at DDP Democracy on Twitter at DDP_democracy on Instagram, and DDP Durban NPC on Facebook. And we would like to continue to hear more around some of your questions, some of your comments, some of your thoughts as it relates to this and other more general governance and democracy and civic education related discussions. We are convening next week another circle of women that speaks to women in leadership and development under the sub-theme of promoting women as change agents for sustainable development in the post-COVID era. And we would appreciate your attendance. This is a hybrid engagement. So if you're not in Durban, for instance, because that's where it's happening in Elang in a hotel on the 17th of August from 8 to 2, you're also welcome to join us on our various social media platforms as well as our Zoom page that will be broadcast live from that perspective. A final one, ngiyabonga kakhulu, and we do look forward to having you again in future. Thank you.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians? Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The Malin Guardian, if you really want to